Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping ourselves into the time machine.
Yeah.
Not for algorithms or the latest political shifts, but we're heading way back, straight back to, well, the foundational bedrock of Western ethics, Socrates.
Yeah, Socrates. I mean, this is the figure who didn't just think differently, he fundamentally shifted the whole game.
He really did. He essentially looked at all the philosophers before him, the ones staring up at the stars, and said, hold on, how are you actually going to live your life down here?
That shift is, well, you could argue it's the single most important pivot in intellectual history, really. Before Socrates, you had the pre-Socratics, right? They were obsessed with cosmology.
Right. What's the universe made of? Is it water? Fire? Something else entirely?
Exactly. All about the fundamental stuff. Socrates just redirects that entire philosophical fire hose away from the cosmos and squarely onto us, human beings, our moral behavior, virtue, ethics, how we ought to live.
And what we're diving into today is just brimming with this fascinating tension. We're calling it the Socratic paradox. Here's this man who famously, constantly claimed profound ignorance, this deep awareness that he actually lacked knowledge.
I know nothing, basically.
Exactly. Yet this same guy dedicated his entire life to this incredibly rigorous, almost punishing method of questioning.
The elenchus.
Right, the elenchus. And that method led him to some of the most radical, fiercely held ethical claims philosophy has ever seen. It's quite something.
It really is the ultimate contradiction, isn't it? This intense conviction that seems rooted in, well, in humility, or at least professed ignorance.
So our mission in this deep dive is to kind of unpack this whole ecosystem. We want to isolate three key elements that are all interconnected.
Okay.
First is you need philosophical method, the infamous elenchus, the cross-examination.
Yep.
Second, the really radical ethical conclusion that came out of that method, this idea that knowledge is virtue.
The intellectualist claim. Very controversial.
Hugely. And third, the profound enduring maxim that sort of encapsulates his entire goal. Know thyself.
Nuti soton.
And just so you know where we're coming from, we're pulling our sources directly from the main accounts, Plato and Xenophon primarily.
The classics.
But we're also filtering that ancient record through, modern academic critique. We want to get the historical context, definitely, but also rigorously examine if these ancient ideas about virtue actually, well, if they hold up today.
Yeah, do they stand the test of time? That's the big question. Okay, so to really get Socrates' mission, you absolutely have to start with his own stated motivation. And he was pretty clear about it.
Which was?
Divine obedience. He genuinely believed he was acting under orders, you could say, from the god, from Apollo, presumably via the oracle.
So not just a personal project. He felt compelled.
Absolute compel. He even asserted quite boldly that his philosophical service was the single greatest good that ever came to Athens. It wasn't a hobby, it was calling, a divine mandate.
Which must have been, completely jarring for Athenian society at the time, right? They valued things like honor, wealth, public reputation, very conventional measures of success.
Oh, completely jarring, because his service, his mission, had nothing to do with accumulating property or seeking political power or military glory. It was about fundamentally redirecting the core values of the citizens themselves.
Away from the external, towards the internal.
Precisely. He stated quite clearly he'd never stop doing philosophy. He'd constantly urge people, don't care so much for your persons or your property, care more for the perfection of your souls.
That phrase is powerful. Austus upos us istieste, that the soul should be as good as possible.
Exactly. It's an absolute moral prioritization. The soul comes first. Everything else is secondary.
And that really sets up the central pillar of his whole way of thinking, doesn't it? The absolute priority of the soul, the psyche. It's not just some vague spiritual idea here. For Socrates, it's the seat of moral agency, right? It's who you are.
Precisely. For Socrates, virtue, and we should remember, arta means excellence of any kind, not just moral goodness. That is the true source of all good things.
Like money, reputation, health.
All of it, both for the individual privately and for the state publicly. His argument was, look, if the soul is perfected through virtue, everything else naturally falls into place. But if your soul is corrupt, well, no amount of external wealth or power can actually save you or make you truly happy.
Okay, but here's where we hit that paradox again. How does this man, who is so intensely convinced of the supreme importance of virtue, how does he maintain this posture of Socratic ignorance?
Yeah, it's tricky.
He holds these incredibly strong ethical convictions, like he's adamant you must never unjustly harm anyone. That seems like knowledge. Yet he insists he doesn't actually know the complete definition of justice or courage or virtue itself. How does that work?
That's the absolute key Socratic intellectual move. It all goes back to that famous story about the oracle at Delphi.
Right, the declaration that no one is wiser than Socrates.
Exactly. And Socrates was, by his own account, genuinely baffled by this. He felt keenly aware of all the things he didn't know. So what did he do? He set out to test the oracle.
By interviewing the supposed experts.
Yes. He went around Athens talking to the people with the biggest reputations for wisdom. The politicians, the poets, the craftsmen.
And what was the verdict?
He found that the politicians, well, they thought they knew everything about running a just state. But under questioning, it turned out they knew very little. The poets. They could compose beautiful, inspired lines, but they couldn't even explain the meaning of their own work rationally.
And the craftsmen. They knew their trade, surely.
They did.
Yeah.
They had genuine technical skill, like knowing how to build a chariot or make shoes. But the problem was they wrongly conflated that specific technical skill with broader moral wisdom. They thought because they knew one thing well, they knew everything well, including how to live.
Okay. So his conclusion wasn't that he had superior knowledge.
Well, none at all.
But superior self-awareness about his lack of knowledge.
Exactly. That led him to make this crucial distinction. He realized that human wisdom, compared to divine wisdom, was ultimately worth little or nothing. His only advantage, his only claim to being wiser, was simply that he was aware of his own ignorance.
Which he called.
Well, we might term it simple ignorance. He knows that he doesn't know. He's aware of the gaps in his understanding.
And the politicians, the poets, the average citizen.
They, he argued, suffered from double ignorance. They didn't know, and they were unaware that they didn't know. They falsely believed they possessed knowledge they actually lacked.
It's like, if you're lost, it's better to know you're lost than to confidently stride off in the wrong direction thinking you know the way.
That's a perfect analogy. Socrates knew the map was mostly blank. The others were holding the same blank map, but insisting it was a detailed street guide. So his humility, this awareness of ignorance, paradoxically became the foundation for his strong convictions.
How so?
It allowed him to hold strong moral positions like never harm anyone unjustly, but hold them as testable beliefs, as hypotheses, rather than dogmatic certainties. He could maintain them fiercely while still claiming he didn't have the final, complete definition of justice and remaining open to subjecting them to constant, rigorous critique through dialogue.
And this rigorous critique, this constant questioning, that brings us to the persona he adopted, the famous gadfly.
Ah, yes, the gadfly metaphor. It's brilliant, isn't it?
It really paints a picture.
He characterized himself, particularly in Plato's Apology, as a gadfly, given by the god to sting the great, noble, but ultimately rather sluggish horse of Athens.
The horse being the Athenian democracy.
Exactly. A democracy that, in Socrates' view, had become complacent after the Peloponnesian War. It was distracted by materialism, by power politics, and was in real danger of ethical drift, of harming itself through moral negligence. The gadfly's job was to wake it up.
You know, that historical context feels really crucial for understanding why he was eventually put on trial and executed. This wasn't just abstract philosophical navel-gazing in some ivory tower.
Absolutely not. It was deeply political.
His constant questioning, his stinging critiques of prominent citizens. It was a profoundly patriotic act in his eyes, but also incredibly inconvenient, even dangerous, especially during that period of immense political turmoil after Athens lost the war to Sparta.
Right. There were oligarchic coups, restorations of democracy. It was a volatile time. And here's Socrates relentlessly pushing people to examine their core beliefs about justice, piety, and good governance.
He genuinely believed his philosophical activity aimed at getting citizens to achieve this artu, this excellence of soul. He thought it was divinely sanctioned and absolutely necessary for the city's survival.
Yes. He was trying to forge citizens capable of true self-governance, of moral leadership. But his method involved constantly showing people, especially powerful people, how little they actually understood about the concepts fundamental to their society and their own lives.
That's not usually a recipe for popularity, is it?
No. It tends to breed resentment, anger, and eventually charges of corrupting the youth and impiety, rather than widespread moral reform.
Okay, so if Socrates' divine mission, as he saw it, was the perfection of the soul, then his primary tool, his engine for achieving that, was the elenchus, this relentless method of cross-examination. This is what he used to sting that sluggish horse.
Right. Precisely. And the term itself, elenchus, or election, is really key here, because it's what linguists call a vox media. its meaning isn't fixed. It sort of shifts depending on the context of the conversation.
It's not just to inquire or to discuss.
No, it's much more active, more confrontational than that. Our sources, mainly Plato, show it can mean things like to shame, to contest, to put to the test, to cross-examine, and very importantly, to refute.
So there's an inherent edge to it. It's designed to produce a certain kind of philosophical discomfort.
Absolutely. That discomfort is part of the point, which leads us to its function. It sounds like the Elenchus isn't just working on one level. It's not purely an intellectual game.
It definitely isn't. It's fundamentally a two-in-one operation. It's fulfilling this double objective simultaneously.
Okay, what are the two objectives?
First, there's the clear philosophical objective, the search for truth, specifically the truth about the good life, about virtue. The dialectic process, the back and forth of question and answer, is meant to chip away at falsehoods and inconsistencies.
Right, to get closer to a sound definition or understanding.
But second, and you could argue this is even more vital for Socrates, there's a therapeutic and ethical objective. The Elenchus is explicitly designed to persuade the person being questioned the answerer to actually care about virtue.
How does it do that?
By exposing, undeniably, the contradictions lurking within their own professed beliefs, especially the beliefs about how they claim to live their life.
So the discomfort, the feeling of being refuted or shown to be inconsistent, that isn't just an unfortunate side effect. It's the mechanism for ethical change.
Exactly. You have to feel the sting of that internal contradiction, that cognitive dissonance, before you be motivated to seek genuine improvement, to actually start caring for your soul.
The cross-examination is the moral exhortation. They're fused.
Precisely. And that's why it was never, ever limited to just abstract arguments about concepts like what is beauty or what is piety in the abstract. Socrates insisted on examining the person's entire life.
Which must be what made it so intrusive, so unsettling, maybe even terrifying for his contemporaries. You couldn't just hide behind clever definitions or intellectual posturing.
Not with Socrates, no. Plato gives us some really vivid passages that highlight this existential dimension. In the dialogue Lysias, for instance, the respected Athenian general Nucius is describing what it's like to talk to Socrates.
What does he say?
He says Socrates cannot stop until he is led into giving an account of himself, of the manner in which he spends his days, and of the kind of life he has lived hitherto.
Wow.
And once he's been led into that, Socrates will never let him go until he has thoroughly and properly put all his ways to the test.
So it's not just testing your definition of courage, it's testing your courage, your life.
Exactly. It's the asymptoid, the testing, the examination of your entire life. That really gets to the heart of the Socratic imperative. Your theoretical beliefs about justice or piety or whatever, they have to stand up to scrutiny right alongside the concrete reality of how you actually conduct yourself day to day.
Okay, so how did it work in practice? What was the structure?
It followed a pretty rigorous, systematic pattern. It's a form of dialectical reasoning. Usually it starts when the other person, the interlocutor, asserts a thesis. Often it's a definition of a virtue.
Like, say, courage is standing your ground in battle and not running away.
Right, a common view. Then Socrates starts asking questions. He elicits further premises, further beliefs from the interlocutor, and often these premises seem quite simple, maybe even obvious, things the person readily agrees to. Wouldn't you say that courage is always a fine and noble thing? Yes, Socrates. And wouldn't you agree that sometimes strategically retreating is the wise and therefore better action? Well, yes, I suppose so.
I see where this is going. So these other agreed-upon premises, when you put them together logically,
they inevitably lead to a conclusion that contradicts the original thesis. If courage is always noble, but sometimes retreating is the better, wiser, and thus more noble action than standing firm foolishly, then courage cannot simply be standing your ground. The initial definition falls apart.
Based entirely on the interlocutor's own beliefs and admissions.
Exactly. The process leads the person to aporia.
A state of intellectual impasse. Confusion.
Yes, perplexity, being a loss. The interlocutor is forced to recognize that a belief they held dear, maybe one they thought defined them, is actually illogical or inconsistent with other things they believe. It pulls the rug out from under them.
But this whole thing really hinges on Socrates' very particular standard for what counts as truth or refutation, doesn't it? I'm thinking particularly of the Gorgias dialogue. He's debating these rhetoricians like Polus and Callicles, who rely on swaying the crowd, on getting applause. Socrates completely rejects that.
He totally does. He explicitly refuses the authority of the many, the popular vote. He says something like, I don't care about the votes of the company. Instead, he insists that he knows how to produce only one witness to my assertions, the man against whom I am arguing.
So the entire argument is intensely ad hominem, but not in the fallacious way we usually mean it, like attacking the person.
Right.
It's directed at the person's own set of beliefs.
Right. It's geared entirely towards testing the interlocutor's internal consistency. Socrates wasn't trying to persuade the audience watching. He seemed laser-focused on reforming the individual soul standing right opposite him.
But hang on a second. Doesn't that raise some questions? If the only standard is the internal consistency of the person you're arguing with, is that really a reliable path to universal truth? Couldn't it just be a very effective way to, intellectually pressure someone or psychologically manipulate them into agreeing with you, or at least into giving up out of sheer exhaustion?
That's a really important critique, and it's definitely been leveled against the Elenchus for centuries. Does it actually arrive at objective truth, or does it merely achieve consistency within one person's belief system at a particular moment?
How did Socrates justify it then?
He seemed to justify it by arguing that he was targeting a very specific kind of false belief, self-deceit. His view was that if a man claims to live, say, a just life, but holds beliefs about justice that are fundamentally inconsistent or contradictory when examined, then that man is deceiving himself about his own state.
So the Elenchus acts like a sort of intellectual cleanser.
That seems to be the idea. It breaks through that self-deception by forcing the person to confront their own contradictions. This leads them into that state of aporia, that uncomfortable confusion, which Socrates saw as painful, yes, but absolutely necessary. It's the prerequisite for genuine self-knowledge and improvement.
Okay, so the process seems to have these two distinct phases then.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. There's the destructive phase that's the famous Socratic sting, showing the person that their cherished ideas, the ones they thought they understood, are actually illogical or unsound when put under pressure. This leads the interlocutor to that crucial realization of their own ignorance. Like Meneno in the dialogue named after him, who says Socrates has numbed him like a stingray, but crucially, he now knows he doesn't know.
A painful but necessary awakening.
And then, ideally, comes the constructive phase. Once the ground has been cleared, once the intellectual rubble of false belief is swept away, the process aims to encourage the replacement of that flawed thinking. With justifiable, rational, consistent principles. Principles that the person has arrived at through reason, through this dialectical process, and by which they can genuinely start to live a better, more coherent, more examined life. It's about helping them formulate the foundations for living well. Okay, so we've got the Elenchus, this powerful, systematic engine of self-scrutiny, and that leads us directly, doesn't it, to the most startling, the most, radical outcome of Socrates' entire philosophy.
Yep, here we go.
What gets called Socratic intellectualism. This absolute non-negotiable equation. Knowledge is virtue.
This is really the centerpiece of his whole moral architecture. It's a bold claim. He argued that moral goodness are day, that excellence of the soul we talked about consists exclusively in a particular kind of knowledge, a specific epistemic state.
So it's not enough to have good intentions or the right habits or good upbringing.
Nope. According to this strict Socratic view, if you possess true, rational, unwavering knowledge of what is good, you cannot, by definition, fail to be good. Your actions will necessarily follow from that knowledge.
So virtue isn't really a collection of separate character traits, is it? Like you might think of courage, piety, wisdom, temperance, justice as different things.
Right. Many people did and do. But Socrates argued, no, these aren't truly distinct. They all ultimately underlie a single reality. They are unified by and are essentially manifestations of this one thing, knowledge. Knowledge of the good.
And why did he think it had to be knowledge?
Well, think about it. Virtue, for Socrates, is the highest aim for the human soul. It's the greatest good. And for it to be truly reliable, to provide unfailing guidance in all situations, it must have a kind of universal consistency.
Okay.
And what provides that kind of universal consistency and rational grounding? Knowledge, obtained and maintained through rigorous reason, through that dialectical process we just discussed.
And the flip side, vice.
Badness. Vice, conversely, is simply the absence of that knowledge. It's ignorance. And ignorance, because it leads you to miscalculate what is truly good for your soul, inevitably brings harm to your soul.
Okay, the really crucial implication here, the one that often makes people, especially modern listeners, just shake their heads, is the absolute denial of acrasia.
Weakness of will, yes. This is probably the most challenging, maybe the most counterintuitive part of Socratic ethics.
He stated it so bluntly, too. No one does wrong knowingly, and no one errs willingly.
That's right. If you perform a wrong action, an action that harms your soul or another's, it is strictly, always, according to Socrates, an intellectual error. It stems from a fundamental ignorance about what is truly the best course of action for your soul's ultimate well-being.
But wait just a minute here. I mean, come on. How could Socrates, this brilliant observer of human nature, seriously overlook the sheer power of raw desire or momentary passion, anger, greed, the lure of immediate pleasure or great wealth? Isn't this just hopelessly naive idealism?
It certainly seems that way to many people.
We see it constantly. People choose the short-term pleasure, the extra piece of cake, the easy money, the affair, even when they know, intellectually, that the long-term good lies in restraint, health, or ethical integrity. How does Socrates account for that?
That's the absolute crux of the disagreement, isn't it? Socrates would counter precisely on that point of knowing. He'd argue that in that moment of choosing the cake or the unethical path, you are not truly convinced deep down at the level of actionable knowledge that resisting it was the greater good for your soul's flourishing.
So I might say I know better, but my actions reveal I don't truly know better.
Exactly. You made an incorrect calculation about what would lead to your genuine well-being. Your intellect was clouded or mistaken at that crucial moment. And the premise underlying this entire challenging idea is itself profound. All desire is ultimately for the good.
Okay, explain that premise. That sounds almost metaphysical. How can all desire be for the good when people clearly desire things that are bad?
He argues that human beings, by their fundamental nature, only desire what they perceive to be good, or at least beneficial for themselves. If someone chooses an intermediate or apparently bad thing, let's say, stealing money, they don't desire the act of stealing because it's bad. They desire the outcome they associate with the stolen money, maybe security or pleasure or power. They choose the act of stealing for the sake of something else they believe will benefit them. They are simply mistaken, tragically mistaken, about what truly constitutes benefit for their soul.
They've confused an apparent short-term or illusory good for the real long-term good, which is virtue and the health of the soul.
Precisely. They made a cognitive error, a miscalculation. So if you take the example of a tyrant who orders the execution of a political rival, Socrates would say the tyrant does this not because he desires evil itself, but because he mistakenly believes that removing that opponent will secure his power, maintain his position, which he perceives as being good or beneficial for him.
But in reality, by committing this unjust act, he's actually inflicting massive damage on the most important thing, his own soul.
Correct. According to Socrates, the tyrant's will isn't weak. His intellect is flawed. He's ignorant of his true good. And this whole framework is absolutely essential for understanding perhaps the most famous and challenging ethical paradox from the Gorgias dialogue.
Which is?
It is better to suffer an injustice than to commit one.
Right. That one definitely stops you in your tracks.
Yeah.
Why? Why on earth is committing injustice worse for the individual than suffering it? Common sense seems to suggest the opposite.
Because remember the absolute priority. The goal of Socratic ethics is the health and perfection of the soul. Suffering an injustice, being robbed, being slandered, even being physically harmed is painful, yes. It damages your body, your property, your reputation. But crucially, it leaves your soul, your moral core, untouched, potentially even strengthened through endurance. Committing an injustice, however, lying, stealing, harming another, unjustly, fundamentally corrupts and damages your most valuable asset, your soul. It introduces disorder, ugliness, sickness into your very being.
So even if you commit the crime and get away with it, feel no external pain.
It's still eternally more shameful, more damaging, and therefore worse for your true self, for your soul's well-being, than if you had been the victim.
And if your soul is damaged by committing injustice, what's the Socratic prescription? Just feel bad about it.
No, much more radically than that. He prescribes punishment. If you commit an injustice, Socrates argues in the Gorgias, it is actually better for you to actively seek out punishment.
Better to seek punishment. Why?
Not as societal retribution, primarily, but as a kind of medicine, a purification ritual for the soul. Just as foul medicine can cure a sick body, the pain and hardship of just punishment serves to purge or cure the soul of its corruption, its injustice. It helps restore psychic health.
Wow. That really underscores how central the soul's well-being is. Which connects this idea of eudaimonia, right?
Exactly. This whole ethical system is deeply eudaimonistic.
Eudaimonia. It often gets translated simply as happiness, but that feels a bit thin, maybe misleading.
It can be misleading, yeah. Happiness today often implies a subjective feeling, maybe fleeting pleasure. Eudaimonia is much richer, more objective than that. It's better understood as human flourishing, living well, a life lived in accordance with virtue, or true well-being.
So it's the ultimate goal.
It is the supreme ultimate value in Socratic ethics. It's the foundational consideration for all our actions. And knowledge specifically, knowledge of the good, is the necessary and, crucially, the sufficient guide that steers the soul toward achieving this specific kind of rational, stable, virtuous flourishing.
So if you truly know the good,
You will do the good and you will achieve eudaimonia. They are inextricably linked in his system. Now, this Socratic intellectualism, this equation, knowledge is virtue. I mean, despite its internal logical consistency, it runs into some pretty serious challenges, doesn't it?
it really does.
Yeah.
And the challenges come primarily because it seems to collide so dramatically with, well, with observed human behavior.
Yeah.
With reality, as most of us experience it.
Yeah. The core objection, the one that keeps coming back century after century, is basically this. Experience, both personal and historical, strongly suggests that people do engage in wrongdoing and acts they know are wrong, while possessing seemingly full knowledge that they are wrong.
They know the good, but they choose the bad anyway, driven by things that don't seem purely intellectual.
Exactly. Driven by immediate desires, passions, selfishness, fear, a whole host of not rational factors.
And this kind of psychological dissent isn't new. It's ancient. We have millennia of evidence suggesting knowledge isn't enough, including from major religious traditions.
Absolutely. Probably the most famous, most powerful rejection of the Socratic denial of acrasia, of weakness of will, comes straight from the New Testament, St. Paul's letter to the Romans.
Right, where he writes,
He writes very poignantly, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." Romans 7:19.
that just hits differently, doesn't it? It resonates with a lot of people's experience.
It really does, and that statement fundamentally challenges the core of Socratic intellectualism. If Tall is accurately describing a genuine psychological reality, this internal struggle, this divided self where your will seems detached from or overpowered by something other than, your intellect, then knowledge alone, simply cannot be sufficient to guarantee virtue.
You can have perfect clarity on what the good path is and still find yourself taking the wrong one because of, well, because of other forces within you. Desire, habit, compulsion, passion.
Precisely. And, modern psychology, broadly speaking, tends to side more with St. Paul on this one than with Socrates. Think about Freudian psychoanalysis, for example.
Okay, how does that connect?
Well, Freud's work paints a picture of the human psyche as this complex battleground. We employ all sorts of sophisticated defense mechanisms, things like rationalization, denial, projection, often to engage in self-deception.
So we can do things we sense are wrong,
Yeah.
but justify them to ourselves.
Exactly. We justify unethical actions or impulses we disapprove of in order to maintain our self-respect or to quiet the guilt generated by the superego.
And these defense mechanisms, according to Freud, aren't just occasional quirks. They're universal features of how the human mind works.
Right. Which suggests that moral failure often stems from a deeply non-rational, often subconscious component, that conflict between the id, the ego, the superego. It's a dimension of human experience that Socrates' pure intellectualism, his focus solely on rational knowledge, seems to completely overlook or explain away.
This critique then inevitably bumps up against that massive philosophical headache, the problem of moral responsibility and free will.
Huge implications there, yes.
Because if every evil act is fundamentally involuntary, if it's always done out of ignorance, as Socrates claims, then how can anyone ever truly be held responsible for the harm they cause?
That's the major social and judicial sticking point, isn't it? Our entire working model of society, and especially our systems of law and criminal justice, are built on the bedrock premise of moral culpability.
The idea that offenders could have chosen differently, that they knew better or should have known better and are therefore responsible for their actions.
Right. But if the strict Socratic claim holds to know the good is to do the good, it seems to effectively annihilate human freedom, at least in the moral sphere. The very capacity we generally assume we have the freedom to choose evil, even when we recognize it as evil, perhaps tempted by gain or pleasure, that capacity seems impossible in Socrates' model.
Choosing wrongly isn't a failure of will, enabled by freedom. It's purely a failure of intellect, a lack of knowledge.
Which logically implies that if someone does wrong, the appropriate response isn't punishment, as retribution or deterrence, but education.
Right.
You don't punish someone for getting a math problem wrong. You teach them the correct method.
But society does punish, often very severely. And it does so precisely because it recognizes, or at least assumes, an element of intentionality, of conscious choice in wrongdoing.
And you see this intentionality, this apparent knowing choice of evil, perhaps most clearly in cases of calculated, premeditated crime. Think about the level of careful planning, the cunning, the sheer thoughtfulness that can go into orchestrating complex crime.
Right, like intricate financial fraud, or a meticulously planned heist, or even a carefully concealed murder.
The person committing that kind of calculated crime seems to be operating with the full, conscious awareness that what they are doing is considered wrong by society, by the law, perhaps even by their own underlying moral sense. They are taking deliberate, often highly rational steps specifically to avoid the negative consequences, to ensure they are never caught.
That act of concealment itself seems to imply knowledge of wrongdoing.
Exactly. That very planning, the effort to deceive and evade detection, seems to confirm that the criminal is deeply conscious of the wrongfulness or evil nature of their intended actions. They are using knowledge, sometimes vast amounts of technical or procedural knowledge, not to be virtuous, but to become a more effective criminal.
They know it's wrong, but they choose the perceived benefit, the money, the power, the revenge that the wrong action enables, which seems to flatly contradict the Socratic idea that the action is merely a simple wrong calculation, stemming from pure ignorance of the good.
It really does pose a significant challenge to that core Socratic doctrine.
So ultimately, this standard that Socrates set, the idea that only perfect, unwavering, crystal clear, rational knowledge guarantees a virtuous life, it starts to look impossibly high for, well, for messy, flawed, real-world human beings.
It does feel that way to many critics, given the inherent imperfections of human knowledge, our emotional volatility, our well-documented capacity for self-deception. The Socratic equation, knowledge-virtue, can start to seem inherently utopian.
A beautiful ideal, maybe, but a standard that's perpetually unattainable by actual mortals.
Perhaps. And the danger, as some critics point out, is that if you classify all wrongdoing as fundamentally involuntary, as merely a cognitive mistake, you potentially risk removing the burden of moral responsibility from the wrongdoer. If it's just ignorance, are they truly culpable in the way we normally understand it? It's a deep and troubling question that flows directly from his intellectualism.
Okay, so we've navigated Socrates' mission, his demanding method, the elenchus, and his really radical conclusion that knowledge is virtue, along with the critiques. Now, let's sort of bring this all together by looking at the guiding principle, the universal maxim that arguably underpins the entire Socratic project. Know thyself.
Nudiciton, yes.
This command feels absolutely essential to this whole deep dive, even though, interestingly, it actually predates Socrates himself.
Oh, absolutely. It's perhaps the most famous of all the Delphic maxims. It was inscribed right there on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Tradition attributes it either directly to the god Apollo or, perhaps more likely, to one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, like Thales or Solon.
So it's already a well-known piece of wisdom. But Socrates really adopted it, made it his own personal slogan, didn't he?
He absolutely did. But it's crucial to understand that its original meaning seems to have been much simpler, much more grounded than how Socrates and Plato later interpreted it.
It wasn't initially about deep soul-searching?
Not primarily, no. The earliest applications seem much more pragmatic, focused on outward conduct and awareness of one's place in the world. Essentially, it was a basic lesson in humility. Know your limits.
Like, don't get too big for your boots.
Exactly. It was a warning against hubris, against overreaching. It encouraged people to realistically understand their own abilities, their strengths and weaknesses, and crucially, their place within the often rigid social hierarchy of the time. Know who you are in relation to others and to the gods.
And it also had that dimension of mortality.
Yes, very much so. It functioned as a powerful memento mori. Know that you are mortal. Don't compare yourself to the immortal gods. Understand your finite nature. Later on, the Roman poet Juvenal used it in a very down-to-earth way, advising men quite pragmatically. Know your financial means, understand your resources, don't try to live beyond your station. Very practical advice.
Okay, so it starts as know your place, know your mortal, know your budget. But then along comes Socrates, and especially Plato, And they take this fairly straightforward maxim and perform this incredible philosophical transformation on it.
They really do. They fundamentally rewrote its meaning, setting the stage for how it would be understood for much of the rest of Western thought. They shifted the focus dramatically inward and also upward towards the divine.
Plato in particular seems to have drastically reinterpreted the phrase to mean, essentially, know your soul.
Precisely. In the dialogue, Alcibiades, though its authorship is sometimes debated, the ideas are very Platonic. Socrates leads the young Alcibiades to conclude that a person's true self is nothing other than his soul, the body. That's just an instrument, a tool that the soul, uses.
So know thyself becomes know thy soul. And how is this knowledge of the soul achieved, according to Plato? He uses that famous analogy, right?
Yes, the analogy of the eye. It's quite brilliant. Socrates argues that just as the physical eye cannot see itself directly, but sees itself by looking into the pupil of another eye, specifically at the reflective center where the good activity of sight actually happens. Similarly, the soul comes to know itself by looking into another soul, and specifically by looking at the highest part of that other soul, the region that most resembles the divine, namely the seat of wisdom, intelligence, and knowledge. Wow.
So self-knowledge isn't achieved through solitary introspection, necessarily?
Not solely, according to this analogy. It suggests self-knowledge comes through engaging with others, particularly in philosophical dialogue where wisdom is sought, like the Olympus. Or potentially it implies that true self-knowledge requires knowledge of the divine, of God, or the forms, which is the ultimate source of all wisdom and goodness.
That is a staggering philosophical leap, isn't it? From know your social limits to know your potentially immortal, divine-like essence.
It's huge. And that Platonic reinterpretation really solidified the maxim's enduring power and adaptability. It could now be applied across almost every subsequent field of thought.
Let's trace that legacy a bit. How did it evolve after Plato?
Well, in the immediate context of moral reform, the phrase became almost synonymous with know your faults, understand your character flaws. The Roman physician Galen, for example, used it this way. He observed quite perceptively that people most prone to error, whether moral or physical, are often the least aware of their own failings.
Ignorance of ignorance again.
Exactly. And this led to ideas like using a trusted friend as a kind of moral mirror. The Magna Moralia, an Aristotelian text, suggests that a friend is like another eye, Segbu, and by observing them, we can better understand ourselves.
And then the Stoics picked it up and really ran with it, didn't they? It seems central to their entire philosophy.
Oh, absolutely integral. For the Stoics, self-knowledge was the very essence of wisdom. It was essential for discovering the crucial Stoic truth, that you are fundamentally a rational being, inspired by a divine principle. The logos or universal reason.
And recognizing that changes how you should live.
Completely. By conquering your irrational passions and vices through self-knowledge and reason, you align yourself with the rational order of the universe and become, as they put it, a citizen of the whole cosmos. It directly linked self-knowledge to ethics, physics, logic, the whole Stoic system.
How did the maxim fare when it encountered the major monotheistic religions like Christianity and Islam? Did they adopt it?
They readily adopted the principle, yes, but often re-inflected its meaning through their own theological lenses. Know thyself was often used to enjoin believers to understand the soul's origin in God, its dependence on divine grace, and also humanity's inherently sinful or fallen nature after the fall.
So knowing yourself meant knowing your need for God.
In large part, yes. In some Islamic mystical traditions, particularly Sufism, the maxim became closely linked to the idea that humanity was created in God's image or possesses a divine spark. This led to sayings like the famous hadith, "He who knows himself, his soul, nafs, knows his Lord, Rab." Self-knowledge became a pathway to divine knowledge.
Okay, so we have the soul, the divine, but then the Renaissance seems to bring this radical pivot back towards the physical body, doesn't it? With the rise of anatomy and science.
Exactly. That period saw another major reinterpretation. With the flourishing of empirical science and detailed anatomical studies, think Vesalius the maxim, know thyself, took on an entirely new, quite literal meaning for some.
Know your physical self.
Precisely. It was interpreted by many as a direct command to study the physical properties of the human body, its structure, its functions, its mechanics. There was a growing recognition of the physical form, the body, as an absolutely integral, perhaps even machine-like component of selfhood. This was, in part, a pushback against purely immaterial or soul-centric definitions of the self that had dominated for centuries.
So we swing from body back to mind, or maybe deeper into the mind, with modern philosophy and then psychoanalysis.
Right. Philosophers like Kant took know thyself very seriously as a stringent ethical command. For him, it meant rigorously examining your own heart, your true intentions, your motives, understanding the basis of your moral judgments before acting. It was about achieving moral autonomy through self-scrutiny.
And Hegel.
Hegel, in his typically grand style, broadened it even further, linking self-knowledge to the knowledge of universal truths to the unfolding of spirit-geist in history. But arguably, the most influential modern reinterpretation, the one that resonates most strongly today, perhaps, came with psychoanalysis.
Because suddenly the self is no longer just the conscious, rational mind that Socrates seemed focused on.
Exactly. Psychoanalysis, starting with Freud, dramatically expands the territory of the self. It interprets the ancient maxim as a profound injunction to understand the vast hidden realm of the unconscious mind.
The drives, the desires, the repressed memories.
All of it. The deep submerged forces, the primitive drives, the early childhood experiences, the defense mechanisms, all the things that, according to psychoanalysis, unconsciously dictate so much of our conscious behavior, our choices, and yes, our moral failures.
So in this context, truly knowing yourself requires a descent into the non-rational, the hidden conflicts. The very things Socrates' intellectualism seemed designed to rationalize or argue away.
It's a very different kind of self-knowledge being demanded, a much murkier, more complex undertaking.
What an incredible journey for one two-word phrase. From don't overspend your budget to understand your deepest subconscious defense mechanisms.
It really shows the power and adaptability of the idea. And it was Alexander Pope, writing in the Enlightenment, who perhaps perfectly captured that Socratic legacy, adapted for his era, didn't he?
Right, in his essay on man. Know then thyself, presume not God to scan, the proper study of mankind is man. Bringing the focus firmly back to the human in all its complexity. #shag outro.
So if we try to synthesize this entire journey we've taken today, we really see that Socrates offered this singular, incredibly powerful, and internally consistent ethical ecosystem.
Yeah, it all hangs together, even if parts are challenging.
Right. The elenchus, that relentless cross-examination, was the systematic, disciplined tool he used, and he deployed it constantly to fulfill that fundamental command to know thyself.
And the ultimate purpose of all that self-knowledge wasn't just intellectual curiosity.
Not at all. It was entirely practical, entirely ethical. The goal was to achieve virtue, understood as knowledge, because that knowledge was seen as the necessary and sufficient condition for realizing the highest possible well-being eudaimonia for the human soul.
And his legacy. I mean, it's just immense, isn't it? You can see his influence everywhere, not just in the philosophical schools that sprang up right after, like the Cynics, the Stoics, the Skeptics.
All tracing their lineage back to him in some way.
But also in the sheer number of later philosophical giants, people like Hegel, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, countless others who felt absolutely compelled to engage with Socrates. They had to define their own ethical systems, either by building upon his ideas, or often by fiercely criticizing and reacting against them. He set the terms of the debate for centuries.
He absolutely did. And the Socratic challenge itself, the one that ultimately led to his trial and execution, his martyrdom for philosophy, it really posits self-examination not as some kind of optional intellectual hobby for the elite.
No, it's much more fundamental than that.
It frames it as a defining core ethical necessity of the human condition itself.
Which brings us back to that stark, uncompromising statement from his trial. The unexamined life is not worth living for human beings. If we take that premise seriously, even partially, what does it really imply about the ethical duty we owe, not just to others, but fundamentally to ourselves?
It seems to imply that we have this ongoing obligation to continually scrutinize, not just our abstract philosophical ideas about justice or goodness, but the concrete, day-to-day decisions, the habits, the assumptions that actually shape the way we are living our lives right here, right now.
It's a call to constant vigilance, really.
It is. And maybe the ultimate question that Socrates leaves us with nearly 2.5 millennia later is this: what foundational beliefs are you listening right now currently holding? Beliefs you rely on every single day to navigate the world, to make choices, but which have maybe never truly withstood the full, rigorous, potentially uncomfortable sting of the Socratic cross-examination.
It makes you think. The work of the gadfly, that internal gadfly perhaps, is never really done, is it?
It doesn't seem like it. There's always more to examine.